For those that are also going to be leading and singing, we still are trying to figure out all the legalities of broadcasting while we're singing. We wanted to do that for the members that are not here so that they have the full service, but we're trying to work through whether that's a copyright issue or not. So for right now, I went through this morning. Derek has an app he's been using. I went through and kind of verified at the bottom of the songs, there's a copyright, if it is a copyrighted song. If there is not a copyright, it's not a copyrighted song. It's been out long enough. It's not any longer under protection. So all of the songs we were singing this morning, all the ones Derek has done so far, and we've asked song leaders to pick out only the ones that don't have a copyright at the bottom. That way we are absolutely sure we're not doing anything we shouldn't be doing by broadcasting these. So why don't we stand while we sing? How about that? I haven't said that. Derek made us do that one time. That was the weirdest thing I've done in my life, is stand in my living room and sing. But anyway, we'll sing all three verses and then we'll have the lesson. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say,
started singing that last song, and I realized, oh, right, I got to go up. Acts chapter 18, if you want to turn over there, is where we're going to be this morning. Acts chapter 18. We're going to be in verses 18 through 23 as we wrap up Paul's second. He has to be here. He insisted, so I guess, get out of here. It is certainly good to see everybody this morning. It's nice to be able to not be looking at a wall, along with a bright ring light in your face, which I've been doing for the past several weeks. It's good to actually see people, and it's good to see people fall asleep again. It'll be nice to see that. Hopefully we can keep everybody awake. I put the camera in front of Charlie so that he can at least see that, and maybe that'll keep him awake during the service this morning. So, as we've been going through Acts, we've seen Paul's first missionary journey, and now we're coming to the end of his second. And so after this long stay that he has in Corinth, if you remember last week, he was there about 18 months. He begins his last leg of this journey, and he goes from Corinth back to Antioch of Syria. And if you'll remember, Antioch of Syria is kind of his launching point, his start and stop point. It's where we mark his end and beginning of his missionary journeys. As he goes from Corinth back to Antioch of Syria, he passes through Cenchrea, Ephesus, Caesarea, and also Jerusalem. Now, Luke's description of this last leg is really only covered here in these last 6 verses. It's very short, but it is immediately after this comes the start of the third journey. Though this description it is brief by Luke, it contains several themes of interest. So this morning I didn't do a scripture reading because we're just going to read it. It didn't make sense to have someone read it and then read it again. So we're just going to read together here bit by bit and just kind of look at some of these aspects. So the last leg of the journey, the first part goes from Corinth to Ephesus, and that's in verse 18. After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. So we talked this morning a little bit about the Nazirite vow, and some believe that this was Paul ending that vow. And that's very possible. The Nazirite vow was not necessarily something that was held throughout the duration, but also remember too that Paul, throughout Scripture really, he talks about how while it's not necessary for salvation, he did not have any problems observing some parts of the law, especially later when he would say, for the Jews I became like a Jew and so forth, so that he could spread the gospel. So Paul leaves Corinth, and he's joined by Aquila and Priscilla. Of course, we know that he had stayed with them and worked with them during that time. And Priscilla and Aquila would also be mentioned several times later in several epistles, and we're also going to look at them again next week as they stay in Ephesus and build a church there and start a church there in their home. And of course, we'll have some chats with Apollos, which we'll look at next week. In nearby Cenchrea, Paul again cut his hair. Cenchrea is a port city about 9 miles from Corinth. This was home of Phoebe, who was a servant of the church there. She's mentioned in Romans chapter 16. Paul, of course, like we said, had taken a vow. It's possible that it was the Nazirite vow. We don't know for sure, but because the mention of cutting the hair is there, it's assumed that that's what it was. Arriving at Ephesus then, if you look down at verses 19 through 21, you're going to see what happens here. Verse 19, they came to Ephesus, and he left them there, Priscilla and Aquila. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Would we expect anything different from Paul at this point? Paul goes to a city. Where does he go first? The synagogue. And he reasons with the Jews. Unless there is not a synagogue, at which point he finds where the Jews are and he brings the gospel to them. All right? So he goes into the synagogue. Verse 20, when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. All right, so a couple of important points here. And again, these are important because this really brings the whole of the New Testament together. Right? Acts is kind of this turning point from the gospel accounts into the letters of Paul that we have. And all the letters of Paul can be tied back in through the book of Acts. And so we see as he's setting up things, he visits Ephesus and they want to know more. They want to hear more. But Paul says, no, if God wills it, I will return. I'm going to leave Priscilla and Aquila here. They're more than capable of continuing this work. But hopefully, if God allows it, I will be back. And of course, he would be back. He'll come back later on. And we'll see that in Acts chapter 19. So, not too far away. Right? At least one more week until we get there. Okay. So, from Ephesus, he now goes to Jerusalem. Now look at verses 22 through 23 here. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. All right, so verse 23 there is the start of his third missionary journey. Okay, that's the beginning, that's the marker point. He leaves Antioch and he heads out, it says, from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So a lot of people, a lot of scholars, and we'll look at this more as we get into the third missionary journey, he's returning to places where he's been before and strengthening those churches, building them up, and possibly setting up others along the way. So, I said that he went from Ephesus to Jerusalem. But did you see any reference to Jerusalem here? No, Jerusalem isn't specifically mentioned. So, the reason why we say that Paul goes from Ephesus back to Jerusalem is because of the language that is used here. Caesarea was the chief port of Palestine. And from Caesarea, of course, Paul would visit here again later in Acts chapter 21. He's been here before. This is an entry point into Palestine, into the Jerusalem area. And so it says in verse 22 that he went up and visited the church. Now the term going up is used throughout Scripture to refer the journey to Jerusalem. And when you leave Jerusalem, it was always down. You would travel down from Jerusalem. Now, today when we think about this, and I admit I get a little perturbed when people, like, if my parents say we're going to come up and visit, because they know you're going to come down to visit because we're south of you, and I think we're also lower in elevation, right? So I get real particular in this because of, you know, what I've read in Scripture, and also it's right. Sorry. But in terms of Jerusalem, Jerusalem was up on a hill. And so to get to Jerusalem, you had to travel up. And to get out of it, you had to travel down. And so when he goes to Antioch, it says that he went down to Antioch. However, Antioch is north of Jerusalem. And so because of the way that the language is used and the direction of travel, it is assumed by many scholars, and I guess I fall into that boat because I assume it as well. I'm a scholar, y'all! I did it! That he went up from Caesarea to the church in Jerusalem, of course, where many of the apostles would have been, many disciples, etc., that were leading the church there. So from Jerusalem, he goes down to Antioch, and then spends some time there. And probably from early summer of AD 52 to the early spring of 53 is how long he spent in Antioch. And then he, basically, that's the end of that second missionary journey. And of course, as we mentioned there, the third missionary journey begins immediately there in verse 23, and we'll continue looking at that. The narration of these journeys in Acts breaks away from Paul for a moment, as we'll look at next week when we look at Aquila and Priscilla, and focuses on this interaction here at Ephesus with Aquila and Priscilla and Apollos. And of course, in 19, Paul gets to Ephesus. So it's a nice little transition. Takes a break from Paul. During this time, we look at verse 23 to see what Paul was doing. And he's going day by day from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So, That's the second missionary journey. So I want to spend the rest of our time this morning talking about the impact of Paul's second missionary journey and some of the things that we saw during this time. First of all, the churches. Paul spent much of his time establishing churches in the places that he visited. He was able to encourage churches along the way in Syria and Cilicia, in Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch of Pisidia. There were churches there that he was able to strengthen and work with and build off of. And then he established churches on the second missionary journey in Philippi, in Thessalonica, in Berea, in Athens, and in Corinth. That's a lot. That's a lot of work. The gospel is powerful, though, of course. Now, there's also some important characters in the Bible that are introduced and we learn a lot about during this time. And these are important relationships that Paul would forge with brethren. First of all, his co-workers. Paul began lasting relationships with several of them. Silas, who we will see in Paul's letter to the Corinthians and Thessalonians. Silas was with him during a lot of this journey. Of course, Timothy, who, as many of you know, plays an ongoing and integral part of spreading the gospel, working with Paul throughout his journeys. And he's mentioned throughout nearly all of Paul's letters. He's even mentioned at the end of Hebrews as well. So very integral in the spread of the gospel. Luke, of course, the author of Acts, and it's the theory of his gospel account, and Acts rings true. What a testament of the relationship that Luke had with Paul to go to the lengths in order to detail Paul's journeys and the gospel truth that fueled his work. And of course, we would hear of Luke later on in Paul's letters as well. And let's not forget Aquila and Priscilla. Again, we'll see more about them next week. A faithful pair who would continue the work of the gospel. So those are his co-workers. But Paul also created lasting relationships with brethren as well, like the brethren at Philippi, Lydia, the jailer, Clement, Euodia, Synecdoche. All of these people would be people he would write a letter to later on. And that letter, of course, is, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called Philippians, aptly named. Then we have the brethren at Thessalonica. They got two letters.